Thanks everyone for attending the Gemalto event today. We're going to be talking about subscription, moving to a subscription model. And my name is Alan Dieter. I'm the sales director for the West. And I've got a couple of my team here. So if you're from Gemalto, please raise your hand. All right, so these are some of the guys that you have questions about the products or want to get more technical, please reach out to them. I've got a couple more outside. I'm going to start today by introducing our speakers. I'll be kind of just your MC. There's not much value I'm going to add. But we have two great speakers today. First up will be Manoj Tharakan from Gemalto. So Manoj has been with us about a year and a half, and he's been in licensing the bulk of his career. He spent a good majority of his time at Cisco, where he's responsible for managing their licensing and entitlement infrastructure, and more so than just the implementation, helping define some of the business models and the impact on Cisco's big customer base and all the different varieties of products and how they wanted to go to market. We're also joined by Joshua Bloom from Simon Kucher Partners. If you haven't heard of Simon Kucher, they're a consultancy based in San Francisco, and they exclusively work in sales, marketing, and pricing. So we did an event with them last year that was a really well-balanced event where we talked about kind of pricing strategy. Then we talked about licensing, kind of a foundational element. We also had Arya in to talk about billing and subscription management. Today's focus is more on moving to subscription. And the reason we chose that topic is many software companies have been on subscription. SaaS companies are typically subscription. But we see a major trend in Silicon Valley and really across the world of what companies are moving in what they call a digital transformation, looking to migrate, have more digital content, monetize all the investment that they put into R&D in and around software, and how do we build a recurring revenue stream? Many of our networking equipment and other hardware companies sell a perpetual license with their hardware. They'd like to move to get some sort of a recurring revenue stream. So how do they manage that transition, both the business transformation, but in training their sales teams and their customers, but also then implementing and making it work. So Manoj will talk about that. Joshua's going to talk about once you're at a subscription model, how do you optimize it? How do you tune it? How do you tweak it? How do you manage that relationship on an ongoing basis? So I think we've got a great set of speakers and hopefully some relevant content for you. So I'll turn it over to Manoj. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Oh, that's a clicker. Thank you. All right. So first of all, why subscriptions, right? So if you look at this chart, typically most companies start pretty well with a perpetual model. You probably also have some kind of feature-based licensing. And then there's this big chasm you got to cross to get to subscriptions. It'll become apparent when we talk about it in some of the future slides. It's a big company shift. But this is what's happening in the industry. If you look at the Gartner quote on the right, more than 80% of all software vendors will move to a subscription-based selling model. So that's just going to happen, right? So if you're not doing it now, your competition's probably already doing it, and you'll be forced to do it just because of your customers expect it. So why subscriptions, right? Why do you need to do it? So if you're a customer, it's mostly because it's a much more flexible offer, right? It's a new business model, it's a new buying model. You can move it to your CapEx, your OpEx lines as opposed to your capital expenditures. You can buy software at a much more affordable price. You can buy in at a low entry level, start with a 1-year subscription. You're not stuck with buying perpetual software and leaving it as shelfware. You can scale as you need. Scaling, you could start with a 100-user license, pilot it in your organization. If it really works well, scale it up for the rest of the organization. That's a real flexible approach for customers. And accessibility. One of the problems with perpetual software is you buy it, you're eligible for that version, but for the next version you need to most companies charge you an upgrade fee. As with subscriptions, you're always eligible to get the latest, greatest version, and you don't have to buy into that whole upgrade sell cycle. Now, if you're a provider, a software provider, Why do you need subscriptions? The number one reason, of course, is it provides a predictable recurring revenue stream, right? So that's great for your finance department, right? They can predict your revenues. And because of this whole concept of customers wanting to get the latest accessible software and your competition putting a lot of new features out there, you're also basically putting a lot of healthy pressure within your engineering organization to get new features into the product, right? So you get accustomed to a shorter delivery cycle with more frequent releases of features. And in terms of product offerings, you get to probably address a whole new market stream that you never had, right? You probably were selling to the enterprise customers, but you can now bring in a low price subscription offer and get into an SMB market, if you would, right? So that's why those are some of the benefits for you as a provider. So now this, as I said, right, in kind of framing this up, right, we're thinking of what are some of the big things, if you're not doing subscriptions, what are the things you need to think about in shifting to this kind of a model? The first one is you need to have a lot of flexible subscription offers. The second, your company needs to be all in on this transformation. If it changes almost, it has impacts on every part of your organization. So everyone in the company needs to be aligned on this shift. And the last one, kind of where Gemalto comes in, you need to have business systems that can support this shift to this kind of selling model. And we'll talk a little more about that. So let's talk about the first one, right? Flexible subscription offers. So I broadly put there are many ways you can organize this. I just broadly put them as in subscriptions you can have prepaid offers and postpaid offers. So if you look at prepaid offers, a perpetual license is also kind of a prepaid offer, especially when you bundle it with maintenance and your maintenance is sold as a term. So that's a very popular model with large enterprise companies. Probably a lot of you are already doing that today. But where you get into a little more granularity is you turn the perpetual license now into a termed license. So your license now has an expiration, and there's a lot of policies, we'll talk about that as well. And the ultimate form of a prepaid subscription offer is not just one product, but an entire suite of products sold in an enterprise license agreement format, right? That's a lot more complex. It has a lot of pricing implications, but probably as large enterprises, something that all of you are thinking about but struggling to get out there, because it requires a much more intimate customer experience. It requires good pricing. It requires a completely different kind of selling. Now, if you talk about postpaid models, one popular one is committed usage, right? There's always a ceiling for the usage. You have how much of you use, you at least owe a certain amount. The next one is an actual usage. It's the true pay-as-you-use, pay-as-you-go model. Some of the more expensive software typically sells in a true actual usage model. And you also have a fixed subscription license model, which is kind of like the second one, except that the payment is not at the beginning of the term, it's more at the end of the term, right? So just a few of them. I'm sure you're probably considering some more offers, right? But broadly, these are some of the more popular offers we've seen in the market. So the second pillar we talked about was when you make this company shift, you need to have company alignment. So company alignment on many fronts. So the first one is making sure that your entire C team is bought into this. All the way from your CEO, your CFO, your operations officer, your chief development officer, everyone, your chief digitization officer, if you have that position in your organization, all of them need to be bought into basically this whole business model. The second one, when you move to subscriptions, you'll be faced with a lot of business policy questions that come up, right? What happens if the customer does not renew on time? Do you allow them some grace? At what point does the grace run out, right? When do you start your subscription? Do you start it when you ship the entitlement, or do you start it when the customer uses it? Right? There's revenue recognition implications in terms of when the subscription starts. Renewals. Do you renew when you sell and basically prorate all the add-ons, or do you co-term or you quote them at the renewal time, right? You basically just sell different a la carte products, and then at renewal time you line up the expiration dates. So this is a policy. And then of course revenue recognition. If you revenue recognition gets really complex if you actually support subscription on activation. And now you need to track when it's activated, feed that back into your finance systems, and make sure that it's all working. And then if you sell a bundle pack, what's your policy? Do you activate this the first activation, the start of the subscription, or do you need all of them to be activated? So third one is the cross-functional approach, right? So when you move into these, when you start having these policies need to, everyone in your organization needs to be aware of these policies and be able to basically have to execute it out, right? And this includes your sales teams, your legal teams, your IT back office systems, your marketing teams, your support teams for sure, right? And the last one, of course, probably everyone knows this, but it's a completely different sales mindset, right? You probably have a team that's selling a lot of perpetual software up front with a hunter selling mentality. Now they're going to be compensated over the term of the subscription. It's a completely different sales mindset, right? And making sure you have the right team to do this, maybe hire new people who have done this kind of business. A lot of it is really about ensuring customer success throughout the subscription, because your renewals on your subscriptions really depend on how your customers use it and how happy they're using it. So now we'll come to the third one, right, which is having business-ready systems. So why do the business systems need to change, right? So in a typical perpetual model, the transaction is typically a one-time transaction. But in the subscription model, there's lots of recurring transactions going on, right? There's a demand for ongoing value. There's new software updates that's going on because you're releasing new features. You're allowing customers to do a change subscription throughout, add users, delete users, co-term, right, extend, all of those things, right? So you need to have business systems that can support these. And then on the back end of it, from a billing perspective, all of this stuff needs to be now, it's not a one-time revenue recognition, it's an ongoing revenue recognition. Probably your customers are asking for also ongoing bills throughout this. So you need to have a recurring billing system as well. So that's where this whole traditional IT back office that was built for optimized more to a supply chain world now is under tremendous pressure, right? Earlier it was just price code, build, deploy, and done, right? Now you have new things like analytics for customer success. You have billing systems. So you're now looking at new systems like Zuora, Aria, Aptus, GoTransfers, all of that now being thrown into your back office systems, right? It's no longer just an SAP or an Oracle ERP system with a front end marketing piece and tied to a supply chain. Now it's all these other different back office systems that come into play, which all need to work, by the way, in cohesion. So this is where Gemalto comes in, right? So we basically manage the licensing, the software delivery, including updates, and the analytics portion of your subscription offers. So just in terms of what you get with the Gemalto solution, we support a lot of our product suite is called Sentinel. We have enforcement technologies with the RMS technology, the rights management system. In the enforcement technology, we support a lot of features on your traditional on-premise offers, but a lot of our innovation right now is in our cloud licensing models. In the entitlements we support, and then that's on the enforcement side, and on the back office side we have a system called EMS, Entitlement Management System. It's also offered as a SaaS offering. We offer it both as a Prem and a SaaS offering. EMS as a service, you have a lot of flexibility in controlling your entitlement start dates. We have the ability to have time-limited licenses, date-constrained licenses. You can control the license start on the license file itself, on the activation. We allow for license grace periods. I talked about those policies that you might have. What if the customer does not renew on the last day? You might want to give him some extra grace period. You can configure some of that into the licenses. You can have license quantities. You can have drawing down extra licenses, the overdraft capability. So we have a fairly rich set of capabilities to help you with moving to the subscription offer. So when you go into a new city, you typically look at their subway map, right? And it's quite complex, right? So this is kind of the same thing that we see with a digital transformation in most of our organizations, right? You're a software device vendor, you want to sell direct to channel to customers, and you want to ensure customer success, right? But if you look at it, you want to move from a hardware-centric model to software-centric models. You need to have business agility, recurring revenue, data analytics. Business models, I showed you some of the business models, right? Your offers, having flexible offers. Your customer experience needs to be instant delivery, frequent updates, self-service, right? Your ability to access your software from any device, anywhere. And then from a back office system, a completely new set of tools, a new set of players in the back office, right? Making sure that your workflows are automated, your entitlement management system works across your prem and your cloud offers. You have flexibility to use the same SKU and delay the choice of deployment down to the activation level, as opposed to having multiple SKUs, one for prem offers, another for cloud offers. All of this is needed. And of course, at the back end of it, the analytics for how your customers are using your products, get customer insights, and a 360-degree view of what your customer actually owns, right? So this is kind of the journey that every organization needs to go through. And as you can see, it's very complicated, and every different department in your organization has a say in this. So that's some of the areas where we can help you. One of the things we do is we actually run a subscription workshop. In fact, I just came back from New York last night doing a subscription workshop for one of our customers out there, a large consumer electronics company that's trying to move into a subscription business. So some of the things we talk about there is what are the industry trends, what are some of the best practices, how can you use Sentinel to support subscriptions. We get very specific in enforcement recommendations and in entitlement recommendations. But I think the rich part of it is really all these licensing use cases. We walk you through several use cases that you should consider as you build out these subscription models. And then throughout the workshop, we will identify the different policy decisions you'll have to make as a company. Again, we will just frame it up for you. I mean, it's something that you'll have to work through the length and breadth of your organization to basically get into a viable policy that makes sense for your organization. And why Gemalto why Gemalto, right? So we are a global company. We are publicly listed. Most of our competition is not innovating in this space anymore. We are doubling down on our innovation, especially in our cloud licensing models. We have a full stack solution all the way from entitlement, software update, software delivery, cloud licensing, and on-premise enforced licensing. We are a security company at heart, by the way, right? So the enforcement is kind of core to our offerings. We integrate with most industry back offices, all the traditional ERP systems, Oracle, SAP, NetSuite. We have connectors for all of that. We also are building connectors into billing systems, ARIA, Zuora, Oracle. Right? We have a world-class professional services and consulting team. Lots of my team members are from large organizations. I'm myself from Cisco. I was a Gemalto customer at Cisco. And some of my colleagues came from Intel. I have a colleague of mine who spent 18 years building the licensing systems at Intel. Again, lots of people from Poetic, Flexera, right? So we have a deep expertise in our consulting and services arm. And then as an organization, we truly believe in a partnership approach. As I said, I was a Gemalto customer myself, right? Back when I was with Cisco. One of the things that impressed me about Gemalto then was how much they were into making Cisco a success back then, right? So that's just the way we work, and I'm sure that If you're customers already, you're probably seeing that partnership approach that we have with your organization. All right, with that, I want to hand it now to Joshua. What I teed up here was really some of the things you need to think about in setting up a subscription offer. Now, once you have your subscription business in, Joshua is going to talk about how you can optimize those subscription businesses, right? What are some of your land and expand strategies? How can you make most of your subscription business? So, Josh.
All right. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited. Sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, so this should be fun. I'm not contagious anymore, so sorry for a stable there. Maybe I'll stand over here. Thank you, everyone, for having me. This is not the first time I've spoken at a Gemalto event, but I obviously think there's a really strong overlap between what they're doing and in terms of enabling subscription monetization and what we do at Simon Kucher Partners, which is help companies with kind of monetization strategy. I'm going to focus my talk today on really the metrics and methods for how to optimize subscription businesses. And some of these will be tied to buzzwords you've probably heard, like maximizing customer lifetime value, land and expand. I'll get into a little bit of the details of why those concepts are so important as you transition to a subscription business and what you can do to help do things like drive, upsell, cross-sell, and renewal. Actually, before I get there, just starting a little bit of company background. So Simon Kucher Partners, as was mentioned before, we're 1,100 people worldwide, just focused on these topics. I'm one of 10 partners in our software, internet, and media group. Spent 15 years with subscription model transformations 10 to 15 years ago, where a lot of software companies moving from perpetual licensing to subscription licensing models, and that's certainly still true. It's almost a half of license models still are perpetual license models for pure software companies. So that is still out there and probably applies to some of the folks in the room. In the last 5 years, obviously, this is a topic that the appliance, networking equipment, server-based companies that have taken to trying to separate out their intellectual property and monetize the software vehicle. And there's still lots of innovation. In the last I've worked with network management, big data analytics, network security, storage, hyperconverged infrastructure, all of these companies that have historically been appliance-based and are trying to optimize subscription offers. My microphone may work better. I'm just going to do a quick switch. Okay, thank you. Clearer? Yeah, okay. Maybe I'll try taking out my phone, see if that's causing an issue. Okay, so that's a little bit of background. That sounds better. Thanks, folks, for bearing with me there. I'll get into some of the details here. So kind of where does the money at the end of the rainbow come from? Kind of how do the economics of subscription work? Fundamentally, there's a key concept here, which is that when you're thinking about a subscription model as opposed to a perpetual license or an appliance sale where it's largely one-time revenue, you're moving to a situation in which that first dollar of annual contract value, or ACV, is relatively expensive to generate. So if you're thinking about developing new logos, the economics are essentially, on average, it costs more than $1 to generate that first dollar of ACV. So your payback period is a little bit longer than 12 months on average, again. This is a study from a couple hundred SaaS companies. And that's obviously, from a cash flow perspective, kind of something you have to overcome, and you have to understand the financial impact of that type of transition. But it's really the other levers that help you kind of accelerate monetization in a subscription environment. It's the fact that once you have a customer, the acquisition costs, the sales and marketing costs associated with generating additional revenue around upsell and cross-sell, around metering usage, which is also often kind of a Gemalto specialty of kind of license entitlement, enforcement, et cetera, and renewal, kind of understanding what you can achieve at renewal, potentially based on kind of analytics around customer behavior. These are all activities that are part of kind of the subscription model that really drive that land and expand strategy. And there is solid economic underpinnings behind that kind of learning to use these muscles is just as important as that kind of initial landing of a customer. Yes, quick question. Yes. Right, so this is metering usage and charging based on usage. Not necessarily consumption-based pricing, because it doesn't have to be kind of a pay-as-you-go type environment, but anywhere where you're using a kind of usage meter to generate additional revenue. Okay, so if we want to talk about how do companies really optimize this model, they focus on these three levers. They focus on driving upsell around metering usage, around driving increases in gross dollar retention through increasing prices at renewal or by minimizing churn. And just as a benchmark here, if you think about the average subscription-based company, most of them are treading water. They're about $1 up for renewal equals $1 actually renewed. The top 20% of subscription-based tech companies are able to achieve 120% plus installed base bookings growth per year. So they create a flywheel that organically grows through these levers and use that to drive increased growth. So I'll tackle kind of each of these, and these aren't fundamentally different than a lot of other kind of marketing and sales strategies that you probably see in traditional business models, but some of the implications are different when you look at them through the lens of a subscription business. From a packaging perspective, this is less about just identifying kind of natural cross-sell opportunities as much as it is thinking about how companies or customers will experience the product over time and finding intelligent ways to create fencing that enables kind of an organic cross-sell event or seeding some additional features that promote that pull type activity. From a segmentation perspective, most companies have a segmentation in place. Whether it's actionable is a whole other question. But from a segmentation perspective, you should start thinking about, do we have a segmentation that clearly aligns with different use cases or roles, targeting specific decision makers, and potentially allowing you to land in one part of an organization and expand elsewhere? And from a price increase perspective, kind of that third lever, do we really understand differences in our own installed customer base to be able to quantify churn risk and think about how aggressively we can push price increases? The last one here is a price model question. Again, kind of have we tinkered with price models enough so that we're overcoming initial budgetary hurdles and potentially drafting off some type of organic growth metric? So I'll give specific examples for each of these and maybe spend a little bit more time on the last one of price increases. From a fencing and seeding perspective, this is an example of a company where it was a subscription software company. They had a free offering and 2 paid offerings. There wasn't a ton of movement between them. As freemium offerings go, their 2% conversion rate of free to paid was kind of below industry standard. So we started to look at some of the factors that could be associated with actual customers deriving value from the offering. So we started to look at value, and in value in this case, the best proxy for that from our perspective was how much time are people spending in the application, kind of what is their true usage and time spent in the application. And you could start to tie that to things like their usage of particular features. If they use a particular feature to a certain degree, are they likely to be spending more time in the application? Again, nobody puts a clock on software and says you've spent 30 minutes in here, therefore we're charging you X. But people do look at different features, and this is another way to think about where to position features kind of in before or after paywalls. Another way we looked at this was, is this something that customers develop attachment to over time? Do they start to use it more as they become more sophisticated in their use? So we were able to identify some of these features, move some of them behind a paywall, and ultimately derive 20% revenue increases by changing the tipping point between free and paid conversion. price model is another one that's worth exploring. I think especially central to this topic of kind of licensing models and enforcement is the underlying question of, are you even charging based on the right price metric? On the left-hand side, it's an example of a fundraising software company that historically had priced based on users. And users fundamentally is something that grows as the size of an organization grows, but it doesn't necessarily tie to the value of that particular application. In this case, we help them move to a records-based pricing structure. You can think of it as size of the database. Other companies in this space, we've now even taken that concept further and done things like active records on a monthly basis, so that you get to true kind of value-based pricing. But even this was something that was a little bit closer tied to value, and also is something that created an organic growth driver of, on average, 14% growth year over year. Something that people could draft off of. The last point here on this slide on the right-hand side is that when we think about price model and price structure, there's usually a heavy focus on volume discounting as well. But it turns out that the way we think about volume discounting might not be optimized for every segment, every solution. This is an example from a self-service environment where the cheapest licenses are the first licenses. So in a team collaboration product, creating an entry-level offer with a dramatically low price point of $10 per month for the first 10 users is a way to drive adoption, and then higher per unit prices kick in as you go to the 11th, 12th, 13th user. Again, I weighed, and there's been lots of testing around this, but again, it doesn't apply to the traditional price volume curve that you would expect, but it's actually specifically targeted to overcome adoption hurdles. Last element of this concept of segmentation is also around making this a simpler buying process for different use cases, for different roles. On the left-hand side, we have a packaging and pricing structure, a kind of before picture, a before and after picture here. 4 packages with 6 pages of features, lots of check marks, lots of technical metrics. Again, kind of a technical feature-led sale. And to be honest, this is a complex portfolio that potentially has different use cases, different buyers. And just the simple fact of, without spending any money on product developments, just splitting the whole architecture into 2 different lineups for 2 different buyers increased conversion in their online sales channel by 60%. So sometimes it's just actually the relevance of the content you're putting in front of people that drives conversion. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the last concept here of the third leg of that stool was renewal activity. And this is probably the most untapped area of subscription optimization. It's not necessarily even the upsell, cross-sell pieces. It's how do you treat that renewal discussion, which in many cases is an annual discussion, sometimes they're multi-year contracts. Either way, in a subscription environment, oftentimes with these advanced capabilities that come with the supporting software layer now, you have to understand customer history just as well as your customers do. You can understand what their support history has been, what their usage and entitlement has been, their feature usage. You have information to make an educated decision on how much to ask for at renewal. Some companies will put in contractual caps or leave it open. About a third of companies leave contracts with no caps. A third have some type of specified cap, and a third roughly do CPI. I would highly advise against CPI, given the way inflation has looked recently. 1% to 2% is well below what most companies are able to achieve. In those cases where you have flexibility in those renewal discussions, being able to say, well, this is an opportunity to right-size our pricing. Remember that first conversation when you were getting new customers in the door was probably the most difficult conversation you'll ever have with them, if you're doing something right. It was an intense conversation. You spent a lot of time, money, effort, et cetera, getting the customer to that point, and they were probably able to wring some concessions out of you at the end through discounting, et cetera. Renewal is an opportunity to right-size people's pricing, to go back and look at similar customers, essentially their peer set, and bring them in line with what other similar companies are paying, other similar customers, and likely what they would see if they decided to shop around from a competitive perspective. The second thing you're able to do is look back at the history of those particular products that they're using and see, have there been investments in the product? Again, in more of a SaaS type environment, they're being delivered product improvements on a regular basis, and this is an opportunity to say, over the course of that contract, have we radically changed the value definition that we're providing? And the last one here, again, is the most critical and the most reliant on some of the new licensing and usage-based models that we're looking at, is the ability to differentiate those increases based on past customer behavior. Can you lean in or lean back from some price increases based on behavioral indicators? Just an example of what this looked like recently for a company I worked for that was in the ed tech space. So you could think about public education being a relatively price-sensitive segment, not huge budgets, but that actually means there's a ton of variability at the initial sale. So I think it actually applies in most cases here. We're able to look at all of their customer data, understand a segmentation of different products people own, different size companies or school districts in this case, and come up with a view of what their peer set is and how far off they were. This is an example of kind of the level of price differentiation you saw. A 20% increase wouldn't even begin to touch how far off some of the deeply discounted customers were. So this is probably a multi-year process for them to get people back to standardized pricing. We looked at the products specifically and said, we're not going to just give everybody a 3% increase because our customers own 19 different products. Let's look at each product individually and understand what's reasonable for that product, how much value have we created, are there differences in the competitive environment, how much churn are we seeing on this product overall? Is it still ultimately competitive and adding value? And the last point here is, again, kind of looking at some of the install-based behavioral environments. So some demographic factors with interesting things like customer tenure having a nonlinear trend, that essentially you could think about your longest customer. Most people would say, well, our longest tenured customers are our most loyal. That's true to a degree is what we found, but there's actually a honeymoon period as well. Kind of the most sensitive people were the ones in basically their second annual renewal, not their first. In the first year, they were sensitive, but they were still willing to give it a shot. By the second year, you either improved your value or this was a very sensitive negotiation. So looking at kind of installed-based behaviors, churn drivers can help identify what are the specific customers and profiles that you can push kind of higher price increases on. People ask, obviously, kind of what kind of effort does this take? And I don't want to minimize that either, that fundamentally kind of moving from a peanut butter spread price increase campaign to something more targeted does require sales effort, does require kind of customer success effort, but it's something that has obviously helped companies kind of really achieve that 20% organic bookings growth off their installed base. So again, happy to answer questions as we go here. I think we're going to do a Q&A next. But essentially, just kind of main takeaways from my talk that I'd like to impart are, one, in a subscription business, there are fundamental upsides of conducting a business model in this way. It's not just financial engineering for investors. It opens up opportunities to create highly productive cross-sell, upsell, licensing moments. There are opportunities to increase bookings at relatively low ACV acquisition cost. But it does force the organization to shift its mindset a little bit from just focusing on that one-time sale to really tuning up these levers to drive upsell, usage metering, and ultimately kind of price increase to the install base, which is something that typically is not done in kind of a one-time sale. So thanks. Happy to take questions from the group.
Do you have another mic?
At the beginning, you mentioned new logos. What do you mean by that?
my comment at the beginning, the question was about what I use the term new logos. New logos for me, it's meant to be the first sale to a new customer, to differentiate it from upsell, cross-sell, which could be a new contract to a pre-existing customer. And again, it's that new logo.
Bring me up. There. Any other questions? There. Here, let me give you the mic.
I was just wondering if you had any stats on churn levels, like industry benchmarks. What are the averages of churn or retention?
Yeah, it's a good question. The question was about retention rates. Sorry, it keeps cutting out. What I would say, I'll separate out pure software businesses. Pure software businesses, retention rates that are in the mid 90% are pretty good. Not accounting for, sorry. I'll try using this one. There you go. Thanks. Mid 90s gross retention rates are thought of as pretty strong across the software sector. That's before you get into things like price increases, upsell, cross-sell. Even low 90s is deemed acceptable, but there's a big curve there, I would say, between what's acceptable when selling to small businesses, mid-market enterprise. So enterprise, 95 to 97% is considered better. You'll be lucky if you crack 90% with kind of a small business offering. And then I would distinguish that from kind of a multi-year term license from kind of an appliance vendor or something like that, which you can almost think of as like a refresh rate as opposed to a pure retention rate. Those tend to be a bit lower. But certainly north of 90 is thought of as strong.
All right, let's test this. It's working. It's just you, Joshua.
Yeah, thank you.
So if you're familiar with the AS 606 guidelines that have come in on revenue recognition, I'm interested in your thoughts and guidance on companies taking on-premise offers or on-premise hybrid to cloud offers, and how to structure those so that you can recognize the revenue over time. Yeah. Particularly if you're taking revenue up, or particularly if you're taking booking up front.
Yeah, so no, certainly with 606, kind of the changes around revenue recognition and how much of certain contracts are ratable is changing. I would say that folks are getting a little bit tighter around there needing to be some type of ongoing delivery aspect that is required. So a lot of companies are either including cloud analytics layers as part of that, or certain SLAs that have some type of ongoing commitment, even if it's not a pure SaaS solution that they are delivering. I'm talking about solving for the kind of corner case of you're in an on-premise environment, you're trying to sell a term license, but you're still trying to have it be ratable. People are getting a little creative there with kind of having some ongoing service element. I would say the other creative thing that I've started to see fairly recently is even the ability to separate out a contract manufactured hard or OEM'd hardware versus software SKU. So you can look at a company like Nutanix, which recently started changing their accounting treatment by leveraging distributors to split their contract manufactured Supermicro and Flex devices, basically was able to, and this is all public information, it's in their filings, but their margins moved from 60% to 70% over the course of a few quarters because they were able to separate out and just take the software SKU on their books as opposed to the hardware SKU and create kind of a different a different revenue and margin profile for themselves. So I think companies are getting pretty creative around ways that they're essentially both trying to create ratable revenue and also trying to focus on software revenue as opposed to necessarily taking all hardware revenue as well.
Okay, I've got a question for you, Joshua.
Yeah.
You mentioned that companies, if on the triangle there, the three things, if it sounded as if you said that if they didn't gather new logos, they just did a good job on upsell, cross-sell, and retention, they could grow by 20%. Is that was that the metric?
Correct. Assuming top 20% of companies, if that's the way you want to look at it, if they had a yes,
If they're a $10 million company and they do everything right, no new logos,
fully recurring revenue, $10 million. They've sold their install base. They can
year.
fire all their salespeople. No, just kidding. Yes, essentially, if they didn't.
Private equity companies love that.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
So, and then what about the next year? Can they sustain that? I mean,
obviously, that's not how companies operate. They have a desire to kind of grow along both vectors, to both grow installed base bookings and add new logos, because it's not fundamentally sustainable. Eventually, someone will come and take your market share and eat your lunch and start peeling away your customers. But that's the underlying economics,
good.
yeah.
Next question. On one of your charts early on, you had a lot of features, and you had the usage by feature, time burst feature.
Right.
If you're not a SaaS company, how do you measure that? How do you get that data?
Actually, I'm going to hand that one over to Manoj to talk about measurement.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the big things is which companies struggle with is how do you capture usage data, especially if you're a prem company. So there's this whole usage collection at scale kind of problem that all of them have to deal with, right? If you're a SaaS company, that's okay because you're collecting usage in your cloud databases. But if you're a prem company, you need that data to come back. So we at Gemalto, we actually have a very sophisticated mediation engine with usage collection that can come from your products. We collect it, we have an aggregation engine, and then we aggregate the data, and then we can send it to any kind of billing provider on the back end. It's a complex engineering problem. What we do is we actually solve it through client libraries that you can embed in your products, and we manage the whole collection at scale problem by our data aggregation engines.
Okay, good question. Just Joshua, general question for you. How many of in terms of your customers, how many of them are, say, SaaS companies, traditional software, or what you would think of more hardware companies wanting to be software? Like, where do you see the most, action and need for help in the market?
It's a good question. I focus more on the B2B sector, so I'll talk about my own personal product mix. I have colleagues who focus more on kind of consumer internet companies, and let's leave that aside. In the B2B sector, when you're saying traditional software licensing, SaaS, and appliance companies that are focused on these like subscription optimization
Correct.
challenges, it's hard to say. I don't see one as dominant right now. I think it's about a third in my mind. I would say that represents a change, though. Having done this for 15 years, it certainly wasn't. It started out as 90% software, 90% perpetual type licensing, 10% SaaS, and appliance companies weren't necessarily thinking that way yet. So the mix has definitely changed over time, and I think actually even accelerated in the last year or two as well. Yeah.
Good. We're seeing that trend as well.
Sure.
Other questions? Happy to take them. It's a good discussion. Yes.
So this goes back to the measuring question. I mean, you talk mostly about the mechanism it comes through. Can you make some comments about how that fits in with what you choose to measure to figure out, what is a feature and how do you break that down and how that fits in with the other side of it?
Yeah, maybe we can both take a crack at this question. The question, I think I understand where you're coming from, which is how do you even decide what to measure? Alone kind of how do you measure it, but how do you decide what to measure? That's a fair question because I've certainly seen cases where people either have nothing or they have so much data that they don't know what to do with it, and they have data on every single click that you can make within a product, and sometimes that becomes an obstacle too. It reminds me of kind of we have a group that works with consumer packaged goods companies, and they were the first adopters of scanner technology and the first essentially adopters of big data around kind of consumer transactions and things like that. And most of their problems now are being overrun by reams of data that they don't know what to do with. So most companies don't have that problem, but I have seen kind of data overload. I think you do have to make some judgment calls about what are the significant interactions that you want to track, specific feature usage. I tend to focus less on the specific click type usage as opposed to kind of major features that you could say have some inherent value associated with them. But yeah, any thoughts on your side?
Yeah, so in terms of usage, right, what we see is there are two kinds, right? There's application diagnostic logs and stuff that the application emits, and then there is monetization units, right? A unit of measure, your features that you want to monetize. So as Josh said, there's a lot of data that comes back. What we try to do is we try to help you identify what's your unit of measure for monetization, because that's the stuff that needs to get integrated to a billing system, right? And we kind of ignore the noise, right? So it requires a lot of, I guess, product management input in terms of what features they want to monetize. You need not even monetize it. Maybe you want to just collect usage just to look at patterns on how your product features are being used. That we've seen as a lot of our customers who use usage may not be selling it in a usage model, but they're kind of preparing to sell in a usage model just by gathering how the software is being used. That helps them basically drive engineering decisions in terms of what features they need to double down on, what features are not doing too well, and they need to not invest that much, things like that, right? So it's again not. I'd also say this on the premise side, usage models is still very new. We have a large networking company that's getting into it. Their monetization token there is subscriber accounts. So they basically give you the software for free, and then they want to collect the subscriber usage and then monetize on that, right? So they're getting preparing for a true service provider usage model, if you will, right? Things like that.
So, certainly it makes complete sense that you would want to understand how your product is being used. So just purely from where do you invest on an ongoing basis, what features do you need to build out, etc. The point about monetizing the features that you see are really being used, more than others, is it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because you would have already sold them the product, and then certainly you can say that you can price that as a surplus charge down the road for new customers, but it does make it kind of like muddies things, when you have when you're charging for specific features based on the attempt to monetize well-used features.
Yeah, no, thanks. Sorry about that. It's a good question. You're inherently monitoring something you may have already monetized if it's a feature that they have in their hands, potentially. But what I would say is a lot of our work does come down to kind of packaging and pricing decisions. So like the concept earlier of fine-tuning what is included in which tier over time. And that's not a static function. Is that fundamentally, if you think about a generic good, better, best packaging lineup, Salesforce or others, all right, with a freemium product potentially as the entry-level product even. Fundamentally, most roadmap capabilities that are developed are typically, for most software companies I work with, solving what is at first a niche problem that not everyone has. We've expended resources to develop something for a segment of customers that are going to be the early adopters of this new whiz-bang functionality. And over time, those early adopters become mass adopters. This is something that most of the market is willing to adopt as a standard part of operations and as a standard feature in competitive offering. And then further down the line, that becomes table stakes. Is it the ultimately kind of commoditization of your own product roadmap over time? So the packaging architecture isn't necessarily static. That if you can monitor usage over time, you can start to see kind of adoption and potentially move things down tiers over time. So being able to understand kind of usage at that level makes sense, even if you not necessarily want to monetize on it, but want to use it as a way to stay competitive and drive adoption. The other thing I would say is there are lots of companies out there who don't have a good, better, best strategy, who have something that looks like an all-you-can-eat strategy. I just worked with one that had over 2,000 features that they were trying to sell to small businesses. If they had ever created kind of a checklist, it would have never ended. It was they called it a 2,000 multi-tentacle squid that was strangling itself. And they didn't know where to start in terms of teasing out what are the core features that everybody is using versus ones that are larger, more sophisticated customers are using. So having some of the analytics behind feature usage really helped kind of accomplish that. Other questions? Good discussion.
From the back, anybody?
Speaking of the renewals, from your experience, what have you seen with respect to the list prices? Is it something that they would go with, the same list prices as that of your initial point of sale, or do they actually go with adjustments only at the discounting level to get to the street?
Yeah, returning to list price is usually something that happens in a self-service channel where potentially it was communicated, you're talking to a rep, oftentimes you'll have a lineup of prices communicated online and then a call us bucket or something like that. So there is a list price that potentially people are discounted off of at the initial sale, or they figured out a way to get a discount off the initial sale. And in those type of environments, it's possible to bring back the concept of list price and try to true up people to list price if that was specifically positioned as an introductory discount. Most B2B environments where there's like a direct sales environment or a channel environment, list price is pretty meaningless. Where you're in kind of heavy discount territory, it's usually net price that becomes the basis for renegotiation. Yeah. Sure. Just got one more. Hold on one.
This is actually just a broader question. Certainly it's very clear to see the incentive for vendor companies to move towards a subscription model. I wonder if there's any kind of like study done on sentiment some sort of sentiment analysis on the receiving end of that, on the actual user, the customer.
Well, if you saw the Gartner quote, it's an expectation. It's an from the vendor side. At least being a buyer of software in enterprise companies, we actually did like the subscription model because it gave us a low price of entry to new software that we needed. Right. One of the challenges enterprise faces, especially if you work in an enterprise with departmental budgets, is since it's an OpEx line, you need to basically increase your run the business budgets year over year. So that tends to be a little more challenging sometimes because if you're in ops, you want to keep a flat line and there's pressure to bring your OpEx budget down every year. So typically how that works is you tend to replace out products that are not being used heavily, right? So you tend to, so this is why it becomes very complicated for ISVs to basically have the best software out there because you could get replaced if you don't provide enough value because you're all competing for the same OpEx budget.
Yeah, I've definitely seen, we have done lots of studies about demand for subscription licensing and things like that. There are still pockets of sectors that prefer CapEx budgeting, government and education and things like that that it's more common, but most businesses have focused on moving to subscription licensing for both budgeting reasons, and I would say the other one is there's a fair amount of baggage from the perpetual license days of companies being sold products that they just didn't use. And having a subscription model that might even have a higher TCO over the long run, but fundamentally is still a place where you can make sure that the vendor has skin in the game over the years is pretty important. That it's a two-way street for the life of the contract and even beyond. Yep.
What's the biggest obstacle for companies moving from perpetual model to subscription model?
Well, I had a little bit of it in the slides, right? One is company alignment, right? Making sure that everyone's all in on that. Sales compensation is a big one, right? If you sell in upfront models, right? Making sure that your sales force now realizes that their compensation plans are all changed. The one more I can think of is just your operational policies, right? Especially if you're a SaaS platform, right? Your service level agreements, your levels of support, there's a higher degree of focus on those things, right? The ability to maintain a high SLA. And the last one, customer success, right? Making sure that your customers get value out of that software, because otherwise, when your renewal comes, they're probably not going to renew that, right? So it's basically ensuring that you're very engaged with the rollout and the use of your software with your customers.
Yeah, I think Manoj hit on a couple of the ones that are commonly we see as well, sales comp being a huge impediment. And some companies go to the lens of, they think they only have to get to kind of a break-even compensation level to drive adoption, but to change sales behavior, most companies will actually over-incentivize subscription, the ones who are really serious about the transition, to kind of get people over the hump of kind of continuing to sell what they've always sold. So sales comp is one. A couple others that I would call out. Obviously, a hurdle at the beginning of the process is typically finance stakeholders of having some risk of kind of a dip in revenue if you move from one-time revenue to ongoing revenue. And fundamentally, you do have to build a business case for how you're going to either accept that and message it to investors or the street, or what most companies do is that they think of it as a rollout over time. Most companies don't rip the Band-Aid and kind of pivot overnight. They blend it into their business by launching with a certain set of products or a certain segment of customers, or basically have dual models that are feeding into their revenue model so that subscription bookings become a larger percentage over time, but you don't see an actual dip. So that's the first stage gate is usually finance, actually. And then, obviously, the investment in the systems to kind of operationalize it. You showed your kind of big circle. There are kind of multiple pieces to managing a subscription business that usually become, I wouldn't say hurdles, but certainly the investments required and the long pole items in terms of the timing, kind of you start on those early so that by the time you're ready with a commercial strategy, you can actually go operationalize it too.
Yeah, Joshua, I fully agree. Number one is the financial consideration of going from perpetual, we might get 100, to going to subscription, we might get 30.
Yeah.
And secondly, operationally. Thirdly, sales team.
Yep.
So
Basically.
here, I'll bring you the mic.
Sure.
Question directed at you, Josh, and I suspect your answer it might be it depends, but I'll throw the
Standard
question
consulting
out.
answer, yes.
Yeah. It applies in a lot of circumstances. All of this dialogue so far has ignored one key aspect, particularly for medium and large size enterprise software, and that's the get starting, setup, kickoff, and onboarding costs,
Right.
which may or may not include switching from vendor A to vendor B, which can be quite extensive and include a fair amount of professional services. Do you see or recommend a specific best practice for how to roll that in, particularly since one of the things that you touched on is a low hurdle to either adopt new or switch cost? So what's your recommendation to ameliorate that upfront hit that sometimes might go above somebody's budget authority, slow down the sales cycle, et cetera, and so forth?
Yeah, there are. I definitely tackle the concept of implementation costs, professional service fees around that. I think for most software companies that were moving from a perpetual on-premise environment to a SaaS environment, costs went down because you're not doing as much customization or modification for the customer-specific environment if you want to maintain the kind of ongoing SaaS standard. So in theory, that had been compressed, but in general, there are still issues, and you do want to drive adoption without creating a friction point for you or the customers around go live. So one of the best practice things that we see is that we often get the specific question, when do you start charging for a subscription agreement that requires a significant implementation approach? And there's the very customer-friendly version of, we will start charging you whenever we go live. The very vendor-friendly version of, we start charging you when the agreement is signed. In the back. The truth is, I think the middle ground is actually what a lot of companies have done that we particularly like, which is, you have a contract signature date. If you know this is going to be a multi-month implementation process, you have a specified date under which you will charge in the future based on the implementation estimate. And you can start, obviously, during the implementation process, you can start charging time and materials, kind of down payments on the rates, so you're not cash flow negative. But it does create an incentive for the customer to be bought into the implementation timeline. I think that's the problem that companies have that just float contract start until actual go live, is they don't necessarily get the engagement from the customer side to drive ahead the implementation process. You need kind of some date hanging over folks, even if it's not the signing date.
Well, if there's work
commitment.
involved in the contract, certainly Rev Rec is held up until customer acceptance. So
Right.
that's always an issue, and that always speaks to when you might start to charge. But still, the primary question on the table, and so let me wasn't quite answered. So let me rephrase.
Sure.
Do you see or recommend amortizing the upfront cost, whether it's setup, pro serve, all of the above, into a subscription, or do you see and recommend pairing that out as a one-time payment, and then whenever the subscription clock starts, it starts.
Yeah.
We don't need to rehash that part of it.
So I have tested that multiple times, and this is another element that I feel correlates pretty strongly with customer size, that enterprise purchasers tend to accept implementation professional fees as a standalone line item. They do not want to see it amortized. If you go down the other end of the spectrum, small businesses really prefer kind of a pay-as-you-go type approach, so they don't mind it being amortized. And on the flip side, usually their associated implementation costs are smaller, so it's to some degree more absorbable for them to have those be part of a subscription fee, basically a zero, getting as close as possible to a zero upfront professional services cost is what small SMB is looking for. Mid-market, you're kind of in a gray zone where you're probably willing to accept slightly lower professional services margins and putting some of that in the subscription amount. Enterprise, there's a pretty strong preference for just carving that out as a one-time expense.
But just to add on to that, as Manoj said, when you do a subscription, that goes onto your OpEx, and that's usually tightly managed. If they go professional services for an implementation, they can capitalize that Even if it's time and materials that you spend over a year, it still goes towards the project, which can be capitalized and then depreciated over multi-years, the life of the project. So it could be depreciated over potentially 5 years. So that could really minimize the OpEx impact of those maybe what could be substantial upfront implementation charges. So we're working with a customer right now that is very, very discerning on what's implementation cost, because it's actually cheaper for them on an OpEx line than the subscription. Other questions? Anyone? Yep. Good discussion. Thanks for the questions, guys.
Based on your experience, can you tell me on the two models that you're presenting, which
Yep.
one has shown the highest level of retention that they've been able to keep?
And when you say the two models, which
Subscription versus perpetual licensing?
well, okay, so I'll break that question apart. Historically, maintenance renewal rates are higher than subscription renewal rates, but it's a little bit of apples and oranges. That's a roundabout way of saying if when you were before, let's say an upfront license was 100, 20% maintenance. If you're talking about the renewal rate on those $20 of maintenance, those were often 98%, et cetera, because it's just being tracked as attached to the life of the license, and then that was pretty common. Subscription renewal rates aren't as high, but on the other hand, you're renewing a higher total dollar amount. So the customer lifetime value is often higher in the subscription amount, even if the percentage that's being renewed is lower.
That matches my experience, even selling the same product into the market. Not here at Gemalto, my prior employer. No, the perpetual license had a higher renewal rate than subscription. Yeah, it higher. And,
Yeah.
the lifetime value of the subscription customer would be higher in terms of total dollars, but even with the lower renewal rate.
Yeah. I mean, there are stories. I've worked with kind of Fortune 500 software companies that have had the same customers being maintenance paying customers for 20 years as outliers, and why you can say that's great. They've been collecting very small amounts of money for 20 years as opposed to with kind of limits on how much they can increase maintenance over time. And those customers are getting a great deal. I mean, most on-premise perpetual license companies at some point choose to end of life support or end of life maintenance at the extreme example to push people off of their maintenance contracts, because some people will just stay on maintenance forever instead of upgrading. And without having that vehicle to upgrade them, you probably can't sell them a new functionality as well. So to some degree, the high maintenance renewal rates almost become problematic for a long-lived customer.
Other questions? Good discussion. Here you go.
Are there interesting differences in the two, subscription versus perpetual license, in terms of how people are concerned about, or how the mechanism of dealing with the vendor going out of business? Do the customers care? How do they care differently?
Certainly, customers do care about vendor financial stability. I haven't seen it, looked at it, thought about it specifically through the lens of kind of perpetual versus subscription models. But to some degree, the risk is lower in a subscription model. You haven't paid up front, though it would be a sunk
No,
cost.
but it
But
stops-
otherwise,
the software
you're not
stops
asking to
running.
make a huge investment up front in a company that might not be viable.
But
in
the
long
flip
run.
side is, if you're using that software, if you have a perpetual license, if that company goes out of business, you can keep using your perpetual, whereas a term license will stop working.
Technically, but if the company went out of business, you wouldn't be able to get support on it, which most people would want. So
True.
yeah.
Okay, well, let's stop arm wrestling. Another question? Yep. The gentleman from NetApp.
In terms of success, of the SaaS model, have you seen any correlation in terms of the sales teams that have sold those? So what I'm getting to is, there are many companies which have been, selling hardware and software, perpetual licenses, then transforming themselves into selling as a service model, right? Well, is there any correlation in terms of, the sales force has been the same and they have been, selling the perpetual models and then they have been selling as a service versus, bringing new folks in? And did you see any correlation in terms of success or, attaining the price points as, good as what it can be as compared to if, they were being sold by someone else?
Maybe it's a little bit different way of answering this, but what I would say, what changes the most when you move between the models is kind of a heavier organizational build out of some of the farmer capabilities that if you're thinking about sales profiles, hunters versus farmers, et cetera, you're not necessarily asking salespeople to change what they're doing. They're largely still responsible for new logos or potentially cross-selling new capabilities. But a lot of the kind of health of the company depends on monetizing the installed base through renewal and through some of the other levers we talked about. So there's usually a bigger focus on building out customer success teams and renewal teams that are, more in tune with how customers are experiencing the software and getting the most value out of it. I don't know. Did you have any thoughts?
That's one of the things we've seen. Right? Customer success teams are kind of a new organization that gets formed when you sell subscriptions. The other thing is also associated with that when you talk about business systems, there are lots of tools now to measure customer success. I mean, there's Gainsight and a whole bunch of new SaaS companies that have come around just managing that customer success aspect of subscriptions.
I was thinking about, much prior to that in terms of the sales life cycle, right? Prior to renewals, prior to measuring the customer success. It's more about, the sales team, because the behaviors that they have selling hardware or perpetual licenses, and for them to, switch over to this newer model, right? It's hard. So I do understand that compensation models compensation plan do play a significant role in this, but have you seen any correlation? As I said, is it more of folks who have been selling as a service models? If you bring them in, they were to do better, or is it more of the current sales force that can get better?
So I would say two things. One, you're right. I think that the biggest hurdle for kind of sales is not necessarily their role changing, it's compensation model. That's the biggest hurdle, is getting the compensation model right. We're used to getting paid on a quick turnaround from when they sign the deals, and now that model changes a bit. Again, the other thing is it's not that the same person's role changes, but sometimes the go-to-market model can change, that software that had been a direct sale can become an inside sales process, or kind of at the extreme, a self-service process. Because the entry point is lower, it doesn't require the same budgetary authority to sign a one-year subscription contract or a pay-as-you-go monthly contract as it would have been to get sign off on a more complex budgeting process. So you can have different go-to-market models that aren't necessarily tied to the same sales deal cycle.
So there's one thing I've seen in sales compensation is to ease that transition. I've seen companies offer accelerators for programs like ELA, right? So the sales guys can get a 3x accelerator if they sell an ELA as opposed to a straight up a la carte subscription, right? So those are some of the strategies. But let's grant it, some of them won't. Some sales folks will never make the transition, right? So that's also reality. But I think with the mix of accelerators, training, transition, I think most of them do.
Yeah. Just a final comment. Yeah, those folks who have been selling perpetual, right? They have been used to like significant discounts, but when they move over to the as a service business, typically you don't do significant discounts, right? So yeah, I think that's the hurdle where they get to see those significant discounts and they have to transition over to a different model. And if they get onto the same behavior, you might not be monetizing it, even the as a service business effectively.
Yeah, sure. You might need stronger guardrails in place around discounting and things along those lines, so you don't harm kind of the long-term customer value. But salespeople are highly efficient at finding the path of least resistance through whatever structure you set up. So if you make it difficult, then and it drains their time to argue over it, then they'll go close the deal. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
All right, other questions? Great, we've had a great discussion. I really appreciate the input and the great, everyone asking and contributing. So I think we're going to wind it up, but please stay. Talk amongst yourselves, grab these guys for a one-on-one conversation, grab some from Gemalto. There's a lot of talent in the room around pricing, subscriptions, licensing, operational side, you name it. You've got a good perspective here in the room. So please enjoy the balance of the afternoon, get a coffee, and once again, thank you for coming.
Thanks.